I saw a great quote from a noted political scientist who said, "America is not a lie, but a disappointment because it is a hope." Would you agree that's a good description? And would you also agree that the U.S. is an exceptional country? Ben, I'll start with you.
To suggest that America is a disappointment is to suggest that utopia is a real place, or that whenever you say somebody's a disappointment, you have to say compared to what? And what exactly are you shooting for? Compared to the ideal, of course, everybody's a disappointment. Saints are disappointments compared to the ideal. But if what you're talking about is America as a whole is somehow disappointing compared to, for example, what other countries around the world stand for, or what they have provided to their citizens, or what they have provided to the globe, then by no means is America a disappointment. America is a tremendous success story. In fact, it's the greatest success story in world history.
I think that the country has failed to live up to its ideals. I think that there are certain things that are transpiring as we speak that go unchecked. You know, we are supposed to have a system of checks and balances, but I think more often than not, we see a system that is in fact rigged in favor of the powerful. There's insider trading happening within the Senate. And I'm saying it out loud, and I'm saying it on a regular basis because that kind of activity, that type of behavior, first of all, is illegal for the average American, should not be legal for members of the Senate. The fact that we have lawmakers who are personally invested in businesses that they're deciding legislation on is unacceptable. So when you talk about the lack of trust in our institutions, I understand that lack of trust. And that lack of trust has led to the situation that we're experiencing today with COVID, where people don't believe in what the CDC is telling them, where people question what journalists are reporting about. They just assume, because of the lies that have been told, because of the system being rigged against them, they just assume that they're being lied to. And now we find ourselves in this difficult position where we're trying to find solutions. We're trying to come together so we combat COVID effectively, get people back to work so people can thrive, families can thrive. But that's incredibly difficult to do when people don't trust in our institutions.
And there's some very interesting surveys out there on trust. Gallup did a survey. There's a drop across the board in trust in all institutions, except law enforcement, which is very interesting. Congress, sorry for my friends there, is the lowest. Media is down there almost as low as Congress. Those that rank the highest were small business and the military.
The media, for the longest time, completely ignored the very real frustrations that workers have been feeling in this country. I mean, the Federal Reserve released data indicating that nearly half of Americans can't even afford a $400 emergency. At the same time, you tune into CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, I mean, it doesn't matter, across the board, and they're like, the economy is doing great. We're seeing record growth, and what they're specifically talking about is the stock market. But the stock market is disconnected from the reality that the majority of workers are experiencing. So I think that that type of stuff leads to people feeling, distrustful toward the press. At the same time, they exist in these filter bubbles and have their preconceived notions. It's hard to challenge that. So there's a lot of different things happening at the same time. I don't blame people for not being so trusting of the media. One other thing that I'll note is that the incentives are always in the wrong place.
Tax the rich is a very popular sentiment. It's also now a fashion statement, I guess, which we've all seen. So when President Biden looks into the microphone and says, pay your fair share, what does that mean?
It means that if you're one of the 55 corporations that literally paid absolutely nothing in federal income taxes in 2020, and in fact received $3.5 billion in tax refunds or rebates, or tax refunds, I should say, maybe you should pay your fair share. But here's the thing, if the tax code is written in a way where corporations can legally take advantage of loopholes and incredibly low effective corporate tax rates, they're gonna do it, right? So it's one thing to say pay your fair share, it's another thing to actually write a tax code that is a little more equitable and ensures that everyone is in fact paying their fair share.
Ben, what's pay your fair share mean?
I mean, the obvious answer would be a flat tax, but the longer answer is that the United States has one of the most progressive income tax systems on planet Earth. Most of the systems in, for example, Northern Europe are far less progressive. The top tax rate kicks in a lot lower on the income scale because you have to pay for the large-scale social services. The people who are at the top of the income bracket in the United States, the top quintile, essentially pays all net taxes in the United States. Not some, not most, all. And the reason for that is because there are tax transfers, and the transfer of payments that are inherent in public services do not accrue to the people at the top of the tax bracket. They accrue to everybody else who's receiving that sort of funding. When we talk about higher taxes on corporations, we do not have one of the world's lowest corporate tax rates. We are somewhere in the middle. Look at the OECD countries. We are certainly not the lowest on the totem pole in terms of our corporate tax rate. In fact, right-wing sources like the Heritage Foundation will say that it is much friendlier to do business in places like Denmark or Sweden in many cases than it is to do business in the United States.
Tax rate's pretty high in Denmark and Sweden.
It is. The personal income tax rate is very high in Denmark and Sweden. The corporate tax rate is basically near or on par with that of the United States. If we were to raise our corporate tax rate the way that President Biden is talking about, we'd actually have a higher corporate tax rate than China currently does. The notion that corporations ought to be paying tax at all, in my view, is mistaken, given the fact that the income is immediately either reinvested in the company or passed on to people who immediately pay all of that tax. By the time you actually receive your income in this country, the income's been taxed about 7 different ways. Right? You're getting taxed through the corporation, then it's passed on to you as salary, which is taxed. If you invest it in the stock market and then you sell your stock, that is taxed as capital gains tax. When you die, the government taxes that as well. So how many times can you tax the same dollar?
To argue that the corporate tax rates in the United States are too high, or that, I mean, first off, let me just touch on the comparison you gave regarding progressive taxes in European countries versus the United States. I mean, yes, the taxes might be higher in those European countries, but what do people living in those countries get in return? They get incredible childcare. I mean, listen, the average American family, 2-income household, spends a whopping 22% of their household income on childcare alone, right? So when you're talking about European countries that offer quality childcare, that, by the way, that opens up the opportunity for people to go to work, something that we should maybe think about as we're dealing with this labor shortage. 64,000 women left the job force in April alone. Not because they want to, but because they can't afford childcare. Everything in this country is privatized. Everything has a for-profit model. And there's consequences that come along with that, including for the business community that might want, a more robust social safety net. So yes, people might pay more in taxes, including those lower on the income scale, but what they get in return is far greater than what people in this country have been getting. I mean, we talk about freedom. If you look at the World Freedom Index, okay, we like to think of the United States as the freest country. We're not the freest country. You look at that list, we're like pretty low down compared to a lot of these Nordic countries. Denmark is top of that list. So look, Denmark has a mixed economy. When we have these debates about, socialism versus capitalism, I think that those debates are a little ridiculous because every country is not every country, but most countries are mixed economies.
Right. The United States is a mixed economy. For sure, true.
Exactly.
Yep.
Now, the issue with the United States is there used to be a time when public universities were free, right? You didn't have to dig yourself into a massive hole to get an education. There was a time in this country where there was universal child care. That was cut down to the point where it's like no longer in existence unless you're desperate and have like no money and need to take advantage of some programs that are available in some states. But my point is, like, we have an issue here where on one hand, we're experiencing a labor shortage. We want people to go back to work. On the other hand, people literally can't afford the childcare necessary in order to put their kids in a daycare, put their kids in childcare.
The notion that capitalism is a system of unfreedom, while government, largesse, is a system of freedom, ignores the fact that somebody actually has to pay the bills. It also ignores the fact that all growth, not some, all growth that has ever happened is a result of capitalism, meaning it is the result of free market transactions in which people consent to services and goods from other people, in which people innovate and make new products. There's a reason that we're not still riding horses and buggies around, and that is because of innovation. It's because of incentive structures. It's because people get to keep the fruit of their own labor and then use those fruits of their own labor in order to invest in things. The true growth in the American economy was never just a question of dollars and cents. It was what you got for those dollars and cents. All of that is driven by entrepreneurs who are willing to take risk. And when you disincentivize risk, you end up disincentivizing people from taking those risks. As we become a much more wage-based society, and that has happened for a large segment of the population, that means that you are incentivizing people to not take those risks. And countries that don't have people taking those risks end up being countries that economically stagnate.
Yeah. So those are the ideas that actually, funny enough, have been repeated over and over again in our education system. The idea that, children or students in this country are taught that capitalism is evil is new to me, because I certainly did not get that type of education. Quite the opposite, in fact. Freedom is an interesting way of framing it, because the fact of the matter is, if you are financially stable, if you are, in the top 10% of this country, for instance, you probably feel incredibly free. You have options, endless options available to you. You probably have a nice nest egg. You have a little bit of that economic freedom. How free do you feel if you're on the precipice of financial ruin, if you can't afford paying for a medical emergency that you're experiencing? What do you do when you don't have health insurance, which tens of millions of Americans right now don't have because of the exorbitant prices associated with it? How free do you feel if you're a wage worker who has not experienced your real wages increase in literally decades? Wages have not kept up with inflation. So how free do you feel when you want to leave your job, but you can't because your healthcare benefits are tied to that work or tied to that job? I mean, freedom, again, is an interesting way of framing it, because I would venture to say that there's a significant portion of the population in the United States, significant portion of workers in this country that do not, in fact, feel free, in fact, have experienced the precarious nature of a capitalistic system that forces them to work endlessly, if they're lucky, in a full-time job, if they're unlucky, in several part-time jobs that they cobble together with no benefits just to make ends meet.
So we've had this discussion in this country, and a member of Congress has called for, and many others have, universal basic income. And her comment was, we should institute a basic universal income for those unwilling to work. Would that be supported in this country?
Would that be supported?
Yeah.
I think on a broad level, the answer is no. Although I think that as time goes on and people become more dependent on government, then the answer is probably getting closer to yes. Should it be supported in this country that people who are unwilling to work should be paid not to work? Absolutely not. I don't see why the government should be incentivizing people who don't want to work and have no excuse not to work.
I mean, look, this is an opinion. I have a different view of humanity, and I think most people want to live lives with purpose. So I think most people do, in fact, want to work. I mean, for me, universal basic income is not the end-all, be-all of dealing with the economic issues that people are having. I know that there's been a lot of focus on that because of Andrew Yang and his presidential run and his, demand that people get at least $1,000 a month. I don't think that that's going to solve the issues. I think that we have deeper problems that we need to deal with, and just throwing money at something in the form of a universal basic income is not going to solve that issue. But if we decide, okay, maybe we're going to experiment with this on top of providing a much more robust social safety net, then maybe we're having a conversation.